Thank you for being here, Professor Michael Morris. Would you like to say hello?
Thank you so much for having. Thank you so much for having me. Let me say ni hao to the listeners in China. And let me also add Zaoan, because it's before 8 a.m. here in New York City. So I'm still getting started on my day.
Good morning. So as we reflect on 2025 and look ahead into 2026, it's a timely moment to discuss your award-winning book, Tribal, how the cultural instincts that divine us can bring us together. Psychology's mission is to understand the human mind. This book reveals one of the deepest truths about how we think, and it gives us a tool to manage a misunderstood strength. Professor Morris, you have advised political campaigns on culturally relevant policies and messaging. As an American and a cultural psychologist, what's your assessment of American society today?
Well, that's a very big question. Let me first respond to a few of the wonderful statements you made along the way, capturing, I think, the key message of the book. You, as a fellow research psychologist, are also dedicated to understanding the human mind and understanding thinking generally. We used to, as researchers, think that humans differed from all the other animals, the other apes, in terms of IQ, in terms of our capacity for abstract cognition or puzzle solving. But we've learned, as I'm sure you are familiar with, in the last 2 decades, that it's really not that abstract cognitive ability that distinguishes us. Young children don't fare much better than young chimps on IQ tests if you change the test so that it's not verbal, if it's just solving puzzles to get treats. But where children really differ from chimps is in their social intelligence, in their ability to learn from other humans. And that is what we now realize was the key adaptation, the key mutation that created our species and made it so different from all the other animals, that we are really, really good at learning from our fellow humans, for connecting to the humans around us. And that's why I became a social psychologist, and in particular, a cultural psychologist, because I wanted to understand the human mind engaging in cultured thinking, thinking that is filtered through the frames of an inherited culture. Now let me, having bought myself some time, turn to your difficult question, which is the state of American society today. Are there any questions that you have for me before I go into that?
Not really.
Okay. Okay. Well, my book argues that humans evolved a series of tribal instincts, which are systems of group psychology that were adaptive for us in the Stone Age and that remain largely adaptive for us today, but that can occasionally go awry. They can cycle out of control and contribute to conflicts. And that's something that's very evident in the world around us today. And most of the time when we hear the word tribalism, it's used in a negative sense. It's used to despair that our evolutionary blessing might also be a curse, and that we as a species may be hardwired to hate outsiders. This is something that pundits like Tom Friedman in the United States have mused about in their essays. And while it makes for interesting journalism, I think it really couldn't be less true or less helpful as an analysis of what's going on in our societies right now. We do have deep conflicts, but so have previous generations. And there are tribal instincts, but evolutionary scientists and behavioral scientists are pretty clear about what these distinguishing features of group psychology are. And they are adaptations for solidarity, not adaptations for hostility. One of the reasons why our species survived and the Neanderthals didn't is that we have this superior capacity for cooperating in large groups, in the large networks that we call tribes. So it's certainly not the case to think that what makes us human is a hardwired hate for other groups. What makes us humans is a tolerance and a curiosity about other groups. And that's part of what has made us, the most successful species on the planet. Now, in the United States today, we do see an example of how these ordinary tribal instincts, which have nothing to do with hate, how they can go awry and contribute to divides. So the first of the tribal instincts that I distinguish in the book, I call the peer instinct or the companion instinct. It's what we might call the conformist side of our psychology, the motivations that make us want to mesh with the people around us, that make us want to agree in our beliefs with the people that we hear talking and the people that we talk to. And when we became wired this way, it was very adaptive because it enabled us to be able to hunt in a hunting party or gather in an organized group or to gather fire and cook, which is something that requires the coordination of several people. So this conformist side helps us mesh with each other, helps us coordinate with each other, helps us cooperate. But it can lead to dysfunctional problems. And one of the things that's happened in American politics, I'm sure that some of the same things have happened in China, but I don't think nearly to the same extent, is that the left and the right sides of the political spectrum have become almost like two distinct tribes, the blue tribe and the red tribe, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. And we've always had these parties, but several generations ago, Americans didn't know which party their neighbors or their work colleagues belonged to. There was the occasional person who would post a sign in their lawn or engage in a political protest, but most people didn't, wear their political party on their sleeve. And there were big divides within each party. The two parties didn't really differ from each other that much. But over the last generation, there's been a couple of dynamics in our society that have to do with the peer instinct, that have to do with this motivation to be around like-minded people. One is what we call residential sorting, which is that whereas Democrats and Republicans used to live in a pretty randomly distributed way, the liberals have tended to move to the coasts and the conservatives have tended to move to the heartland. So now you have this geographic division and you have ideologically inbred communities. And then after that, we started to have a splintering of our media environment where people began to receive their news from ideologically slanted sources. That started with cable news shows back in the 90s, but then it got more intense when people were getting news from websites, and then it got even more intense when people started getting the majority of their news from social media. And that's the world we live in now, where Americans get, 80% of Americans say they primarily get political news from their social media feed. And social media is a filter bubble. It's exposing you to a small subset of the range of opinion. And then whenever you expressed an opinion, you get immediately rewarded with opinions and with agreement expressed by the people listening to you. So it intensifies a kind of conformist process of learning about politics. And Democrats are learning about politics from a completely different set of sources than Republicans are. So when Democrats hear Republicans speaking, they're completely baffled. They can't understand how these people are reaching these conclusions from the facts, because what they think of as the facts are quite different from what Republicans think of as the facts. So as a result of that, we don't trust each other anymore. We think the other side is either cognitively impaired or insincere. And as a result, there is a decline in bipartisan collaboration. There's very little bipartisan legislation anymore, which is how our government is supposed to work. And ordinary Americans no longer want to have anything to do with people from the other parties. So it's a sad state of affairs.
Yeah, as you are talking about information bubble, let me ask a bit more. So, well, given the social media and the AI that have created a tight information bubble where people mostly see views that match their peers, and those algorithms just tap into our natural design to connect, reinforcing different worldviews.
Exactly.
To build a more harmonious society, Professor Morris, what do you think the next generation of digital platform should do to encourage people listen to and respectfully engage with those outside their circles?
Well, I think that's a great question. What should they do? And then another question is, how can we get them to do that? Which is another important question. What I think I would like tech platforms to do is to, they have algorithms that uprank some content and downrank other content. A very small subset of social media posts are the ones that circulate very widely and affect opinion very widely. And there's a lot of great research showing that posts from the two political extremes have much, much higher circulation than posts from the center, which is where the majority of Americans are in their beliefs. So one thing I would like is for platforms not to uprank extremist content on both sides. Another thing that I would like them to do is not uprank statements of moral outrage. There's this tribalistic phenomenon that we call virtue signaling, where if I'm a member of one party and I hear something that a politician on the other side has said that I disagree with, I will express extreme disgust and moral outrage and say that it's an inhuman way of thinking, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And then I immediately get showered with praise from the people who agree with me, for being so bold as to make this statement on social media, which, social media has made it much easier to engage in virtue signaling. Before, you would have to go to a political protest and get in the face of the other side, potentially get shoved. Now, all you have to do is type, and you also reach a larger audience. So people have become literally addicted to this virtue signaling behavior and the dopamine blast that comes when they get showered with praise. So I would like it if they would downrank the two kinds of content that play a crucial role in this. I noticed that there's an organization in England that decides each year which new word in the English language is the word of the year. And the word that they chose for 2025 was rage bait. Bait as in fishing bait. And the idea is that people, post things online, in order to incur the rage of the other side, which then makes the original poster look like a hero to their side. So it's this complicated game where the extremists on both sides need each other, to gain status within their respective communities. And again, this is another distortion of tribal psychology that happens in this new unfamiliar environment of social media that we've found ourselves in. But I would argue that none of this comes from hostility. None of this comes from a hardwired motivation to hate the other side. It comes from the peer instinct, which is a conformist process of learning, a conformist process that first, creates the attraction of social media and then creates conformist learning within social media. And it comes from what I call the hero instinct, which is the status-seeking side of our psychology, where we want to be regarded as a contributor to our community. We want to gain the praise and respect of our community. So we do things that we think are contributions to our community that uphold the standards of our community. And we gain certain benefits as a result of doing that. So both the peer instinct and the hero instinct are really important aspects of our psychology that help us work in towns, help us work in scientific disciplines, help us work in corporations. They're adaptive most of the time, but they've both become maladaptive in our politics. Now the harder question would be, how can we get tech companies to consider making changes? The polarization that we are experiencing right now benefits tech companies enormously. It also benefits extremist politicians. So we have some powerful forces arrayed against change. And the exhausted majority in the center of the political spectrum, we would benefit from this change. But how do we get it? I believe that we need, in the United States, in China, obviously, you may not need this, but we need some legal changes because, we have this very individualistic society, very individualistic legal system, and tech platforms, starting with, Yahoo and Google, back in the 90s, they classified themselves in terms of the law as being more like a newsstand than being like a magazine. So a magazine is liable if it publishes content which is defamatory or untrue and leads people to, leads to harm. But the newsstand is not liable because the newsstand is regarded as this passive intermediary. And so it may be that the platforms in the 90s, when they first started, were like a newsstand, but they've become very different now because they uprank and downrank content, and they target certain kinds of content to certain kinds of people. And so they've become even more important than the journalistic sources themselves in determining what people see and determining what people are influenced by. So I think we need some lawyers to work very hard and bring cases to the Supreme Court suing tech platforms in order to get a changed legal standard and a changed regulatory regime with regard to how tech platforms operate and what incentives would lead them to make changes.
Well, that wouldn't be easy. And actually, it will be a bit challenging.
Yes, I would imagine that in China there is more liability for social media platforms about content, and as a result, they may be more careful in terms of what they put on. I think that the incentives are all wrong in the US right now, where the incentives are to put the most provocative, inflammatory, simplistic content to the front page. And that's led to a decline in our democracy, a decline in our civil society, a decline in the quality of our discourse.
Well, you've also mentioned some positive cases of media. For example, I've read about the Hutu and Tutsi conflict in Rwanda, and my colleagues and I have also studied how the human brain reacts to large-scale humanitarian crises. And we even thought about using neurofeedback training to change people's mind. So when I read your book, what struck us most was how drama, as a form of education, actually help reshape cultural perspective and encourage cooperations among different communities. So how did you first come to recognize the power of edutainment?
Well, that's a great question. Let me first say that I've read your work on brain imaging and how brain imaging helps us understand a very curious phenomenon that we sometimes feel more empathy for the suffering of one individual than for the suffering of a million individuals. There's a quote by Joseph Stalin where he says that the death of one soldier is a tragedy, the death of a million soldiers is a statistic. And I think he captured, he's a very practically intelligent person. He captured what in psychology, we call the singularity effect or the identifiable victim effect, that a story about one individual plays into our neurological capacities for empathy more easily than a story about an aggregate, because we are wired to deal with people one at a time, at least deal with empathy, with this kind of desire to help people. That's usually something that happened at a small group level. And you've done some great work, showing how this operates, in the brain. Now, it is certainly relevant to edutainment and why stories about individuals can have powerful effects, sometimes effects that are much larger than campaigns based on statistics. The singularity effect that you've done wonderful neurological research on is very relevant to why edutainment works so well in public health campaigns. The standard way of running a public health campaign, whether it was to try to encourage family planning or to reduce child abuse or to encourage better nutrition, would be to produce pamphlets showing statistics about how this changed behavior results in better health outcomes for a group of people. It would be sharing the results of studies with people, the kind of studies that you and I do. But those campaigns were never very effective because people weren't very captivated by this abstract statistical information. And what was learned in the late 20th century is that serial dramas, what we call soap operas, or what in Latin America they call telenovelas, are an importantly powerful engine for shifting people's behavior. This was discovered largely by a guy named Miguel Sabido, who was a telenovela producer in Mexico City. And Sabido had read the work of Albert Bandura, who is a learning psychologist who was one of the first to emphasize that most human learning is social learning, which the behaviorists of the mid-20th century in the United States had this hyper-individualistic view that everything was learned from the direct experience of rewards and punishments, and they were sort of ignoring the human nature of humans. And Albert Bandura did brilliant work proving this, And it became widely known, and Miguel Sabido saw it and said, I think this is why people have such strong reactions to the telenovelas that we produce, because people are taking life lessons from the characters in the telenovelas. The telenovelas would typically screen for an hour a day in prime time every day for a year. So it became a part of people's daily life. It became, a big part of their social exposure. The characters in these telenovelas were like the most interesting people that you had contact with. So if the telenovelas featured, a woman who had no children, more women would decide that they didn't want to have children. Or if it was a man who was very concerned about his daughter's education, then people would become more concerned about their daughter's education. And so Sabido decided to start deliberately shaping the telenovelas to target one particular behavioral change. And he found that this was remarkably effective, much more effective than the previous government public health campaigns that had used cold statistics as a way of trying to get people to make these changes.
Well, the fact that the people would emphasize more the single life of human being also relates to the other fact that we humans are not rational. We once thought we are, but Kahneman and Tversky's work showed how fallible we can be. So in his book, Thinking Fast and Slow, Daniel Kahneman showed us two thinking systems. The system 1 is fast, intuitive, and automatic. And the system 2 is slower, logical, and deliberate. And he proposed that the two systems together shape how we think, judge, and decide. And now you suggest the humans are tribal beings, driven by peer, heroes, and ancestor patterns. Does this tribal model reflect a dual system at a social level? For example, a fast, culturally rooted system 1 and a slower, logical system 2. For example, can our cultural instincts be turned on and off?
Questions that, from a researcher's point of view, I can see your research mind working. I'll start by saying that Kahneman and Tversky were not only heroes but mentors to me at the beginning of my career. I started as a professor at Stanford University in the 1990s, and two of my colleagues there were Albert Bandura, who I mentioned a minute ago, and Amos Tversky. And Danny Kahneman at the time was at Berkeley, the neighboring university. And when I was choosing, where to go to graduate school, I was thinking of working with Amos Tversky, thinking of working with Danny Kahneman, and then I ended up a few years later starting as a professor, having them as colleagues. So this distinction between system 1 and system 2 is a very big part of my thinking and a big part of my research. Now, the answer is not simple, in that, as you noted, or as you surmised, the three tribal instincts are instincts that can operate unconsciously. So they are parts of system 1. I think of system 1 as intuition and system 2 as reason. And so these are systems that operate unconsciously and quickly to essentially map the communities that we're a part of. We are consciously forming images of the ways of our group. And then we rely on those images or mental representations as a kind of autopilot for getting along in our communities and collaborating and being understood and coming to gain respect, et cetera, et cetera. So we both learn our cultural representations unconsciously, and we often follow them unconsciously, but we can also follow our cultural knowledge when we are thinking slowly, when we are reasoning. So, you know, you may find that when you are planning an experiment, you know, in your university office, that you draw on certain cultural frameworks, like, you know, statistics. That's a cultural framework in science. Or there may be a particular theory that you've learned from your mentors. I noticed that you studied at one of the best universities, Ye Zheng University in Hangzhou. So you may have learned things from your great professors there that that guide your research ideas as you're thinking slowly. In my scientific research, I've conducted some research showing that certain kinds of cultural bias are more prominent when people are under high cognitive load and thus having to think more unconsciously, and that these biases diminish when people think slowly and think in a more consciously controlled way. But there are other cultural biases, you know, cultural differences that come from our inherited cultural knowledge that become more prominent when we are thinking slowly. That's more counterintuitive, so I can give you an example. Years and years ago, back in the 90s, I did some research with a student named Donnell Briley, who is now a professor in Sydney in Australia. And we were curious about claims that people had made that Chinese consumers were more likely to make decisions in a way that compromised between two goals, as opposed to picking one and sacrificing the other. So imagine you're choosing cameras, and some of them are less expensive, and some of them have, you know, more pixels. What the claim was is that the Chinese consumer will choose moderate price and moderate pixels, whereas the Western consumer might choose, you know, the lowest price with low pixels, or the high price with high pixels. And what we found was, you know, we would see this pattern sometimes, but not others. And then we started doing experiments where we would vary whether people had to give a reason for their choice before they gave the choice, whether you had to state some reasoning. Basically, we were invoking system 2 by requiring that. And what we saw is that when people had to give a reason for their choice, then we started to see a dramatic cultural difference. That Americans, when they had to give a reason, would give a reason like, pixels are more important, or decide what you want and choose it. And people in China would be more likely to give a reason that was something like, moderation is most important, or, you know, choose the middle way, or something of that nature, some sort of proverbial decision rule that enjoins people to compromise between two goals. So in this case, these cultural decision rules, they affected people more when people were required to think slowly than when people were thinking quickly.
Well, in everyday life, we are influenced by these cultural instincts implicitly or explicitly. So those cultural instincts do pose a real challenge for leaders trying to change behaviors or mindset. You have highlighted successful examples like how Lego become one of the world's most powerful brands. What lessons can other company leaders or founders take from those examples to build or to reshape culture in order to sustain innovation?
A very great question, and a central one to the book. I'm a professor in the psychology department at Columbia University, but my primary position is in the Graduate School of Business. And I've worked as a business school professor for 30 years, giving advice to companies and teaching groups of business executives every week. So that's very much, the center of my career. And I wrote this book in part as a guidebook to business and political leaders who want to harness culture so that it's an opportunity for them. It's a force that helps them accomplish their goals, as opposed to culture being an obstacle. And many politicians and business people think of the cultural traditions of a group as an obstacle to change. And I'm trying to get people to think, no, culture can actually be a change maker's best friend. It can be a secret weapon if you understand the psychology of how culture operates in the mind, and you know how to activate culture, and you know how to alter culture. Now, there are many specific points in the book about how leaders can harness culture in particular ways. I break it down into these 3 levels of cultural codes: peer codes, which relate to the peer instinct; hero codes, which relate to the hero instinct; and ancestor codes, which relate to the ancestor instinct. They correspond to what we might call norms, values, and institutions, 3 basic layers of culture. And there are different levers for changing these different layers of culture. But the biggest changes, and the kind of changes that Lego had to make, are what we call transformational change, where a company realizes that the current culture that they have doesn't support the new strategy that is needed in the changed environment. And so they need a fundamentally new culture. They don't just need to strengthen the current culture or activate the current culture. They need to alter the culture. And most attempts to alter cultures backfire, whether it's a political leader's attempt to change the culture of a society, or a CEO's attempt to change the culture of an organization. There are always a lot of people invested in the status quo, and they actively resist change initiatives, especially change initiatives coming from the top. And so how do we ever have successful transformational change is a big mystery in organizational theory, organizational behavior, the fields that I teach about. And in the book, I argue that cultural change or societal change or organizational change involves changing codes at the 3 levels that I talk about in the book: the peer code level, the hero code level, and the ancestor code level. And the biggest mistake that leaders make is trying to change all of them at the same time. Leaders can send signals that affect people's understanding of their culture, and that will gradually shift people's sense of the culture. But the signals get mixed up and confused if too many kinds of signals are sent at the same time. That's why in most successful change programs, whether it's a 12-step program that is trying to cure somebody from an addiction, or it's a 7-step program that a consulting company is guiding a company through to try to change its culture, most of these models of managed change involve discrete steps. Do this first until you accomplish something, then move on to trying to change the next thing, then move on to trying to change the third thing. And one model of transformational change that can work very well that I think the tribal psychology helps us understand is what we call the grassroots strategy. And the grassroots strategy is bottom-up change. It means that you start by trying to change the daily behaviors of ordinary people. And then you hope that if this becomes a widespread enough phenomenon, that opinion leaders will take notice, journalists will take notice, politicians will take notice. People will start to articulate the change in a way that affects the shared values in the society, not just the local behaviors of ordinary people. And then as those values shift, eventually people will start to feel safe about changing the institutions, changing the policies, changing the traditions. One of the examples that is often given for bottom-up change might be one familiar to your listeners, which is the story of the Chinese Communist Party. It started as an urban movement with a lot of university intellectuals who weren't very good at, being political activists. And then they realized, okay, we need to retreat to the countryside and we need to reshape our ordinary lives and become the kind of people that are capable of reaching out to the rest of society and making a change. And eventually what commenced is called the Long March, which was this very long process of walking almost the perimeter of China, and helping, proletariat, peasant groups along the way and, fighting small battles, etc. And only after that long process of changing the values and disseminating their ideas in the country did they take power and try to change the government institutions. So we may call something a revolution, but it was a long, slow process that took decades. And similarly, in the United States, when you have social change like the change towards same-sex marriage, which happened over recent decades, that was a long, slow process that took decades and then eventually reached the Supreme Court and became locked in as the law of the land. So bottom-up change is one model. It can start without power. Ordinary people, activists, can start the process of bottom-up change, but it doesn't always succeed, and it takes a long time. There's another model of change that CEOs and government officials tend to like, which is called top-down change or shock therapy change. And this is the idea that you make a sweeping change to institutions and it disrupts values and it disrupts routines such that people become motivated or willing to change in a way that they wouldn't be otherwise. Just like when a cardiac patient has an irregular heartbeat, they will administer a massive shock all at once, and it can kind of reset the heartbeat back to a normal heartbeat. So this is the model that CEOs often try to use, and it has a high failure rate because when a CEO comes in, especially when an outsider comes in and makes massive changes to the familiar institutions, it creates cultural blowback. People are very motivated to undermine the process. In the book, I talk about many examples of successful and unsuccessful top-down change. I can run through a comparison between two of them if that's helpful. One pair of examples that I give in the book are examples of female CEOs who became prominent around the year 2014. The first example is a woman named Ellen Pao. She was a well-known lawyer in Silicon Valley, and she was brought in by Reddit, the social media platform, to clean up its act because Reddit is a very unregulated site, and as a result, various scandals happened on Reddit. So they thought they needed to bring in, an adult who understood rules, who could set some rules and create more order. But Ellen Pao's efforts to do so led to a user revolt, and people used the very structure of Reddit to undermine her. So they would downvote her her messages about the changes she wanted to make. And then when she apologized because it didn't go well, they downvoted that into oblivion. And as a result, she had to resign because there was a groundswell of protest against her. Now, at the same time, another woman, Mary Barra, reached the C-suite at General Motors, which is a company that for most of the 20th century was the largest corporation in the world and sold the most cars in the world, but it was a famously inertial organization, a very bureaucratic organization that moved very slowly and had trouble adapting to changes in the world. And it was declining in its profitability, and it had to go into bankruptcy at this time. And Mary Barra realized that many changes were needed. But what she chose as her first public change was she ripped up the dress code at GM, which was a document that had accumulated over decades. It was like 25 pages long, lots of rules about how people had to dress. And she ripped it up and told people the new dress code was simply dress appropriately, 2 words. And this caused tremendous discomfort in this bureaucratic organization where people were used to being told what to do by headquarters. And people were very uncomfortable, and she said, no, I'm not going to clarify. It's up to you to decide what is dressing appropriately in your unit of GM, whether it's the legal department or the assembly line. And eventually all the different parts of the organization made their decisions, took ownership of their decisions, and lived with it. And it created an immediately visible change that all employees at GM saw, which is that people were coming to work dressing in a very different way than they had for decades, and dressing differently depending on who they were and where they worked. And it sort of revitalized the culture. It was a breath of fresh air. And GM was then able to change in more profound ways. They became much more open when they had safety scandals, as opposed to being defensive about it. They became open to autonomous vehicles. They became open to electric cars. They became open to many other innovations that the automobile industry is starting to adjust to now. So Mary Barra was successful in her top-down change, and I think the thing that is probably the critical factor here is that whereas Ellen Pao was an outsider brought in to Reddit, which companies often do when they feel change is necessary, they bring in an outsider. Outsiders are often tone deaf to the ideals and the values that are most important within a culture. So the changes that Ellen Pao made were perceived as impeding on the free speech of the Reddit users, and that is a core value at Reddit. And so she trampled on a core value and was seen as out of touch and lost her job. Mary Barra, on the other hand, had not only worked at GM since age 18, but she came from several generations of GM workers, and she had gone to college at GM University. So she knew GM as well as any human alive knew GM, and she was able to choose something at GM to change that was emblematic of the culture, but was not something that anybody would be too defensive about, because everyone at GM knew that the dress code was out of date, and they thought of it as one of the indications of how GM was slow and behind the times. So when she ripped that up, people felt like, okay, well, this is a breath of fresh air. This is a sign of the changes that are coming, but they didn't fight her on it. So I think insider CEOs have an advantage when it comes to trying to figure out what kind of top-down change will send a shockwave through the organization, but not incite a mutiny.
Well, as you just mentioned, your primary position is at the business school, but you're also a psychologist. So you
Yes.
must have been advising multinational corporations. And in an increasingly complex world, the multinational corporations not only face the cultural problem, they also have the challenge to encourage the ideas and talents flowing across border and to foster collaborations rather than separations. What would be your message for them, the multinational corporations?
Again, you're asking me wonderful questions, very challenging questions, but they're the questions that my research for decades have focused on, and they're the questions that I tried to write about, in my first popular book, Tribal. One of the topics that I've conducted a lot of research on is called cultural intelligence. And it's analogous to what 30 years ago we talked about a lot, which was emotional intelligence. At that time, organizations were becoming more diverse and they were becoming more flat, and people needed to collaborate more. And so it was a big emphasis in the field that managers had not only to be good abstract problem solvers, but they also had to be good at reading people and perceiving people's talents and motivating people, encouraging people. And this was known as emotional intelligence, and it was regarded as a distinct strength that some managers have, and one that can be cultivated in particular ways. And organizations went to great lengths to try to cultivate emotional intelligence so that they could have more collaborative teams and more diverse workforces. Now, in the last decade or so, we see the rise of global corporations, and companies want to tap into the global talent pool. They want to hire Indian engineers, and they want to hire Italian designers, and they want to hire, British copywriters, and they want to reach global markets. Every American company dreams of selling in China to the 1 billion customers. There are places like Africa where the demographics skew much younger than in, say, Europe. And so companies are becoming very motivated to get inside the minds of the African consumers. So in this new world that we live in, that you so aptly described, what becomes really important for global and international corporations is what we call cultural intelligence. And cultural intelligence is this set of strengths which help people be effective as a manager or a leader in intercultural environments, whether I'm working as an expatriate, which as early in my career, I twice went to Hong Kong for a year to teach, and so I was having to be effective in my career in a different society. Now, it wasn't that hard because I could use my English for most things, but there were some things I had to adjust to, right? And so being an expatriate is one example of an intercultural environment, but working on a global team is another, where, if I work for a company that is trying to reach global markets, I might be put on a task force with one person in Hyderabad and one person in Antwerp and one person in, Nairobi, right? And so we have to collaborate. We have to understand each other. We have to make decisions and find consensus. So whether it's working on a global team or being an expatriate, cultural intelligence is important. Now the question is, what does cultural intelligence consist of? And it consists of slightly different things than emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence consists of things like the ability to read facial expressions or the knowledge of different shades of emotion. These are things that characterize people of high emotional intelligence. Some things that characterize people of high cultural intelligence are a greater degree of self-awareness about the cultural frames that one uses and the cultural frames that others use. So as an American, my intuitions are highly filtered through very individualistic conceptions of society. You know, the American notion of the individual is that the essence of the individual is to be alone, you know, and all society is like an artificial imposition on the true nature of the individual, which is to be alone, you know. And so we think of behavior as primarily reflecting the individual's personality. And when we are explaining another person's behavior or making sense of another person's behavior, we are guided by those individualistic frameworks. And I know a lot about this because at the beginning of my career, when I was a graduate student in the 1980s, you know, I started working with professors at Beida in China to try to capture this difference in social cognition, that Americans think in this very person-centered way and commit various biases as a result, you know, over-interpreting things in terms of personality. Whereas in China, people think in a much more social group-centered way, where they think of individuals as embedded in relationships and organizations and social groups. And so they're less likely to commit certain biases where we over-interpret things in terms of character. But instead, there are other biases that people in China are more likely to exhibit. So this is work that I did with Professor Kai-Ping Peng, you know, who is now at Tsinghua University. But I'm aware of that, and so it doesn't stop me from doing it, but it means that when I'm doing it a lot and it's causing confusion in a cross-cultural interaction, I can figure out what's going on and catch myself, and I can let system 2 override system 1 and start thinking in a more social group-centered way so that my Chinese colleagues understand me better and I understand them better because I'm aware of this particular way in which cultural frames affect my thinking. So one of the big goals of cultural psychology, this area of psychology that I work in, is to try to capture the major ways in which cultural frameworks filter our everyday inferences, and to understand the syndromes or patterns of thinking that characterize Americans as opposed to Chinese, as opposed to Indians, as opposed to Russians, etc., so that we can all be, we don't want to lose these biases because they're part of what make us who we are, but we want to be aware of these biases so we know how we come across, and we are capable of meeting people halfway, and we are capable of understanding the styles of thinking of other people. Another aspect of cultural intelligence, in addition to this self-awareness, is curiosity, you know, having a high degree of curiosity about other cultures. It's a myth to think that, you know, humans have this hardwired animosity towards other groups. One of the major responses that we have to other groups is intrigue. It's curiosity. You know, we find other cultures fascinating, and this is not new. Human beings have been like this for, you know, hundreds of thousands of years. You know, we have been interested in other human groups, and most of our interactions are peaceful and profitable. So we want to encourage that side of human nature. We talk a lot about ethnocentrism, but there's this other side of human nature called allophilia, which is, you know, this enjoyment of otherness And there have always been Americans who wanted to be friends of China and who became Sinophiles. And there have always been people from China fascinated with the US. You know, it's a young country, but one with some interesting quirks. And so we should encourage that. We should encourage Americans to move to China and try to learn about China. And we should encourage Chinese people to move to the US and learn about America, because those people are conduits for cross-cultural collaboration, and they can help corporations and other organizations work for the betterment of both countries.
Well, when you mention emotional intelligence, that just reminds me a hot topic of psychology and artificial intelligence now is affective computation. That means we're gonna model how people understand other people's emotion, and maybe one day to the goal that we can teach artificial intelligence to understand the people's emotion. But then you mentioned the cultural intelligence. Well, it could be another interesting topic of cultural psychology and AI. And maybe one day we could teach AI to understand people's behavior in the context of a specific culture. And definitely it would interpret Americans' behavior in a different way compared to Chinese behavior. So, well, let's talk about...
Fascinating question. You're on the very cutting edge. Over the last month, I've gone to a number. I also do research on AI, and a lot of cultural psychologists are using the tools of AI to analyze culture in new ways, because we can look at enormous corpuses of texts and analyze cultural themes in those texts rather than relying on surveys or other methods that we used to use. And one of the things that people are working on is affective computing in order to make robots empathetic, to make robots who pick up on your emotions and adjust what they're doing as a result of your emotions. And these robots are really uncanny. They're very good. It's really they're almost too good. So I think a big problem that we are facing now is that we are going to have virtual companions available to people that are very addicting, because they provide a substitute for social interaction, and one that in the short term at least might seem comforting and maybe even better than your human friends. But it's going to take people away from human relationships more and more, and I think there are going to be lots of problems that come from that. But your real question was not about emotional intelligence in robots or AI systems, but cultural intelligence. And I think that cultural intelligence will not be that difficult for AI to accomplish, because just as we are using different corpuses to extract different cultural themes, that's very similar to how large language models work. I have a former student named Jackson Lu, who's now a professor at MIT, and he's probably the best organizational behavior scholar of his generation in the world. He's becoming very, very prominent. And he did a study recently where he took many of the classic questions that cultural psychologists use. So, for example, classic questions about, how a person should solve a problem. And, when you give those problem-solving questions to people in the US, they suggest a different answer than people suggest in China, because people are brought up with slightly different value priorities. And what they did is they gave those questions to large language models in different languages. So I'll give you an example. One of the questions was, you're on a camping trip in the country with a friend, and you receive a text message on Saturday afternoon from your boss at work telling you that there's a big problem at work with the software that needs to be fixed. What should you do? How should you reply to the text? And they either gave that question in English to ChatGPT, or they gave it in Chinese to ChatGPT. Or in another condition of the experiment, they gave the question in English to DeepSeek, or they gave it in Chinese to DeepSeek. And what's really amazing is that these programs suggested different answers depending on which language they had been addressed in. So when they had been addressed in China, the answer was something like, tell your boss that you are immediately going to hike down the mountain and take the next train to the city where you work and meet him to try to work all night to solve this problem. And when addressed in English, the answer was something like, tell the boss that this is your first vacation in 6 months, and you will be glad to talk to him about this problem on Monday when you are scheduled to return to work. So it's a difference between the more individualistic frameworks of the West.
So as you mentioned at the very beginning, tribalism is often used in a negative sense, and it's often blamed for humanity's worst conflicts. Yet you argue that it is our superpower or secret weapon when channeled positively. Your book emphasized that tribal instincts can be harnessed not to divide but to unite. You cite President Lincoln's words, with malice towards none and with charity towards all. If Lincoln were alive today, how do you think he would help bridge social divides and promote national unity?
Well, it's a wonderful idea that Lincoln could come back. we need him at this moment. But I think it's interesting because in the US, the pundits often say, America has never been more divided. And I think someone who says that doesn't have a very good understanding of history. Abraham Lincoln was elected with less than 40% of the popular vote. And in between his election and inauguration, 10 states seceded from the country. And then you had a bloody internecine battle combined with epidemics and draft riots and many other problems. So while we have it tough today, it's nothing like what Abraham Lincoln had to deal with. I think that the populists today are primarily divisive populists. The phrase, make America great again, is on the surface a very positive sentiment, but implicitly, it references that generations ago there was a better America, and that this America was less diverse, that was more of an English-speaking Christian white nation. Now, it never was that. There were Muslims who died in the Revolutionary War. There were many African Americans, many Native Americans. The languages spoken in this country have always been diverse. So populists sometimes traffic in simplified views of the past, and sometimes those simplified views of the past are used to divide people in the present, to blame problems on immigrants. Abraham Lincoln did the opposite of that. He engaged in inclusive populism. He made reference to the past to bring groups of people together by noting that they had common ancestors and that these ancestors had traditions of celebrating the benefits of cooperation across divides. The holiday of Thanksgiving that we recently celebrated is something that most Americans believe was created by the Pilgrims, the first settlers on these shores. But in fact, the holiday as we know it was largely created by Abraham Lincoln. And it was done because the country needed a ritual of reconciliation to come back together after years of a bloody civil war. And he referenced the Pilgrims and he referenced George Washington so that the new holiday that he was proposing would have the feeling of an established routine. And in a few years, it became regarded that way. It became regarded as a sacred tradition. So we can use the tribal instincts in people's nature to bring them together, just as we can use them to divide. And I think if Lincoln came back for a third term, we're talking about presidents having a third term. So if we could get Lincoln to come back for a third term, I think he might introduce another new holiday. He might introduce Constitution Day, where we would celebrate that what binds our nation together is agreement on a contract about how government should work. And that contract is a bundle of compromises. Compromises between the more urban, liberal parts of our society and the more rural, conservative parts of our society. So the grand compromise at the center of our government is to have a Senate with an equal number of representatives from each state, but a House of Representatives with a proportional representation from each state. And that was a compromise to protect the interests of the large states, but also the interests of the small states. Now, there are many other traditions in our country related to the Constitution that could be celebrated on a holiday like Constitution Day. The Constitution first took effect in March, I believe, of 1789. And we already have lots of holidays in the summer and in the fall, so perhaps we should celebrate Constitution Day in March and celebrate how our government is supposed to work.
Last question. As China plays an increasing major role in shaping world order, what is your key message to our audience? What single mindset shift can help turn competitions into a force that elevates not only national interests, but also global prosperity, peace, and mutual progress?
And I want to answer with humility that I'm just an American friend of China. I don't know as much about China as Chinese people do, but I would give this perspective, which is that China becoming a superpower, or perhaps the superpower, is not an entirely new thing under the sun. For most of the last 2,000 years, China has been a superpower, often the superpower. 2,000 years ago, the Roman Empire and the Han Dynasty were both at their height. They had relatively equal populations, millions of people under the same government. They had large standing armies, and that points to technology, logistics, social organization. Now, Rome fell, and China didn't fall 1,000 years ago. But then China did fall in the last 2 centuries, and that fall is now over, and China is reassuming its position as one of, if not the most powerful nation. And I would argue that with power comes responsibility. Americans have not always been terribly responsible with the power that we've had recently in the last 100 years. But we've tried to do some things to help the world, to help other countries, to help international comity. And I think the key is that responsibility means the mindset of thinking that one is a citizen of the world, not just a citizen of one's country. We have always lived in nested groups. From the beginnings of the Stone Age, we lived in bands that were inside of clans, that were inside of larger tribes. And similarly now, we live in cities that are inside of nations, that are inside of the larger humankind. And so I think that China is doing many things that are good for the world, like developing electric cars, developing solar power, exporting that to many parts of the world. But I would encourage more of that because China is powerful, Chinese people should be thinking of the entire planet and how they can make a contribution to help humankind.
Thank you, Michael. That's a wonderful suggestion. And thank you so much for this very, very deep thinking and inspiring dialogue.
Well, thank you for the wonderful questions.